Archaic Records.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Archaic Records here with you again. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. And for today's episode, we're going to go back to April 8th of 1960 to take a quick look at the album that marked a return to the entertainment industry by the king of rock and roll, Mr. Elvis Presley, following a 2-year hiatus due to his military service overseas. The album in question is the appropriately titled Elvis Is Back. Now, if you go back to 1957, I think you would be very hard-pressed to find anybody in the music industry who was flying any higher than that of Elvis Presley. That is until December of that year, when he receives a letter in the post from his federal government informing him that his presence was being requested because he had just been drafted into the United States Army. Now, by this point in time, Elvis Presley had begun work on his 4th feature film, King Creole, and therefore was granted a brief furlough in order to finish up the production of that film. But by March 24th of 1958, Private Elvis Presley had enlisted into the United States Army. And if you are an Elvis fan, I'm sure that you are well aware that there are many conspiracy theories floating around out there as to why Elvis Presley would be drafted during the height of his career. Many of those conspiracy theories I'm actually somewhat inclined to agree with, to be perfectly honest with you. But beyond that, this must have just been an incredibly difficult time in the life of Elvis Presley. Not only was he forced to put on hold a very hyper-successful career, but he was removed from his home, taken away from his friends and family, and as if all of that wasn't already trying enough, on August 14th of 1958, Elvis's mother Gladys passes away rather suddenly. Now, Elvis's relationship with his mother is well documented, and Elvis was granted a brief leave during this time to return home to Memphis to help see to his mother's arrangements. But not long after that, Elvis Presley is shipped overseas to spend the next year and a half of his life in the role of, as he himself described it, a common soldier. So on March 5th of 1960, when Elvis is finally discharged from the United States Army, you can only imagine how happy he must have been to be back home stateside, back in his beloved Memphis, Tennessee, surrounded by his friends and his family, and how excited he must have felt just to get back to work and try to put his career back together. He was so eager, in fact, that just 2 weeks after being discharged from the United States Army on March 20th of 1960, Elvis Presley finds himself right here in Nashville, Tennessee, where he begins work on his first single, Stuck on You, which, along with its B-side, Fame and Fortune, are released just 3 days later on March 23rd of 1960, out and in stores in time to be performed live on March 26th, 1960, on the Frank Sinatra television special, It's Nice to Go A-Travelin', a television special that has since sort of informally been dubbed Welcome Home Elvis. But just 2 days after performing on the Sinatra special, Elvis is right back down here in Nashville, Tennessee, where between then and April 4th of 1960, he is putting the finishing touches on what would become his first full-length studio album since the King Creole soundtrack, which was released in September of 1958, that being, like I said before, the appropriately titled album Elvis Is Back. Now, to me, this is an album that isn't necessarily as good as the early LPs that he had released on the RCA label, but this is a damn fine effort, considering that Elvis had just spent the last 2 years of his life completely removed from the public spotlight. And this is an important album for a couple of reasons as well. One being that this is probably the last classic Elvis Presley album, and I mean classic in terms of quality, that would be released until June of 1969, when he released his album From Elvis in Memphis, which to me is still the greatest album of Elvis's career. This is also an important album in the sense that the album that follows up Elvis Is Back in September of 1960 is the soundtrack to Elvis's next feature film, which is G.I. Blues. So this album is the last sort of traditional Elvis Presley album that is released before he goes back out to Hollywood and resumes his film and soundtrack career. And this is an album, like I said before, that I think is a damn fine effort. Now, this isn't necessarily a record that I go back and listen to quite as much as the early LPs. I certainly do not listen to this record as much as I do listen to From Elvis in Memphis, which, like I said before, I think is the greatest record that Elvis ever made. This is a record that I probably don't listen to even as much as most of the studio albums that Elvis released in the 1970s, because, quite frankly, the 1970s are my favorite era in Elvis's career, at least musically. But this is an album that I think still holds up the test of time. This is a record that I do go back and listen to a fair amount. This is a record that was released on April 8th of 1960, just 4 days after they finished up the recording sessions here in Nashville. This record was produced by Steve Schultz and Chet Atkins. This album sort of features elements of rock and roll, rockabilly, doo-wop, R&B, West Coast blues, and something that they sort of used to generically refer to as the Nashville sound, which was one of the sort of calling cards to one of the co-producers on this record, and that being Chet Atkins. Of course, this album features Scotty Moore on guitar, Hank Garland on electric bass, Bob Moore on double acoustic bass. Piano was Floyd Kramer, DJ Fontana, and Buddy Harmon on drums. This album features backing vocals by both the Jordanaires and Charlie Hodge, and this album features Boots Randolph on saxophone. This is an album that, to me, is a very important piece to Elvis's catalog, because this album does mark the return to the music industry after being away for 2 years. And as I said before, this was the last sort of traditional album that Elvis would put out before he went back into doing some of the soundtrack work, which, over the years, I really defend what Elvis did during the 1960s in terms of the films and the soundtracks. Now, let's be perfectly honest with you. Nobody has ever accused Elvis Presley of being the next Orson Welles, and nobody has ever mistaken Harum Scarum for being Citizen Kane. But, what Elvis did in the 1960s, to me, as a fan, as somebody who celebrates his entire catalog, is something that was at least entertaining. Now, what this record does, to me, because this record is of relatively high quality, it's one of the better records in Elvis's traditional album catalog. It raises the question, what would have happened had, when Elvis Presley returned home from the military service, had he just sort of, gone back into doing what he does best, which is cutting records. Let's say Elvis comes back in 1960 and he thinks to himself, okay, I have 4 feature films in the can. That was fun, but it isn't necessarily, where I excel. Let's sort of concentrate. Let's focus more on what we're doing in terms of music. It would have been interesting to see where Elvis Presley's career would have gone, or how it would have been different than it was in the 1960s when he was sort of tucked away doing the films. I would predict, based on the quality of this record, and especially the quality of the record from Elvis in Memphis in 1969, that had Elvis continued making traditional albums, he would have not suffered the sort of, and I use this term loosely, lack of relevance that he sort of fell into post-British invasion, when he was sort of frozen in time in, not necessarily a good way. And he sort of fell out of favor when it came to the youth culture. I think if Elvis would have continued making records and sort of left his film career in his rearview mirror, I think it would have benefited his career. Now, not that Elvis's career is anything to sneeze at. It certainly isn't. But I think most Elvis fans will acknowledge that Elvis's career definitely took a dip, at least into the mid and late 1960s, once those films started to get pretty rough. Now, like I said, I defend the guy's entire catalog. I find Elvis's films to be very entertaining, but this album and the album From Elvis in Memphis, the two albums that sort of bookend his output of the 1960s, it makes me sort of wish that he would have just sort of pursued music and kind of left the film career where it was. Because if you go back and you look at Elvis's first four films, Love Me Tender in 1956, Loving You in 1957, Jailhouse Rock in 1957, which is my favorite Elvis movie of all time, and King Creole, which came out in 1958, which is probably his most celebrated movie. I mean, with the exception of maybe a couple, maybe Blue Hawaii, G.I. Blues is pretty good, but did he do any movies post-Army life that were as good as those first four? I would make the argument probably not. So I've always been sort of curious as a diehard Elvis fan, how his career would have looked differently had he come home and just focused on doing what he did best, which was making records such as this one. Anyway, this record starts off with a song called Make Me Know It. This song was written by Otis Blackwell. If you are an Elvis Presley fan, you are familiar with at least some of his work, because he is responsible for several Elvis hits, including Don't Be Cruel, All Shook Up, and Return to Sender. And every time I listen to this record from start to finish and I sort of drop the needle on side one onto this song, I sort of picture myself being a diehard Elvis Presley fan living back in 1957, just having your heart ripped out of your body upon hearing the news that Elvis Presley was being drafted into the military and therefore taken away from his public for an indeterminate amount of time, and how much anticipation and eagerness you must have felt waiting for Elvis Presley to return home, waiting for him to start putting out records again. And I always picture myself as that fan that the day this record is out, you run down to your local record store, you're there the second the doors open, you run in, grab this record off the shelf. I mean, you're physically vibrating with anticipation. You take this record home, you throw it on the turntable, you drop the needle on side one, and as soon as this song starts, you're sort of hit with this overwhelming sense of relief. One, because this is a killer tune, and two, because this song, when you start the song, it sounds as if virtually no time has passed in terms of Elvis's career. This and the first single, I would make the argument, Stuck on You. You go back and you listen to that first single, Stuck on You. Elvis Presley's voice is just in peak condition. Musically, instrumentally, this song sounds as if it was something that was taken right off of one of his previous recordings. Of course, by this point in time, 1960, even though Elvis Presley had been gone for a couple of years, rock and roll had not yet really begun to evolve at, the alarming rate that it would later on. This is still pre-British invasion. So you take this record home, you listen to it, and you're just immediately filled with this sense of relief and sense of joy, because this really is a good song. I think it's actually the perfect song to start off this record, because it does feel as if very little amount of time has passed between 1958 and April of 1960 when this song is released. I love this song. It's got a great vocal performance. Of course, that's something you could say about everything that Elvis ever did, but his voice was still just in peak condition. His voice was never out of peak condition. Although Elvis's physical health may have deteriorated dramatically over the years, one thing that never left him was his voice, and this is a killer opening track on this record. Great vocal performance. The second song off this record is Fever, which was written by John Davenport, Otis Blackwell, the aforementioned Otis Blackwell, and Eddie Cooley. This song was originally recorded in 1956 by Little Willie John, and at the risk of just sounding superficial, this is just a cool song. It's sensual, it's seductive, it oozes sexual confidence. I mean, one thing about Elvis you gotta believe is that this guy knew how to scrub some rug. I mean, you don't have the amount of experience that Elvis was able to gather throughout his life and not become a pretty skilled carpet cleaner. And I gotta tell you that regardless of what you look like, which of course Elvis was at a marked advantage in that department, but regardless of what you look like, Once the ladies find out that you have the combination to the safe, you don't ever have to worry about being alone again. Part of me, every time I listen to this song too, I picture Elvis Presley in the studio, because this is a very sort of sexual, sensual, seductive song. I sort of picture in my head him fantasizing about the young girl that he had just recently left behind, and how at a certain point in time he was going to convince that own girl's father to give him the keys to that package. I mean, that was a pro move. If you don't believe that Elvis was a gangster, you need to go back and re-examine that little piece of the man's history. I love the song Fever. It is probably one of the more well-known songs off of this record. There are a couple songs on this album that I think stood out as being more recognizable. Fever is a song that I really never get tired of. Now, there are some of the bigger songs in Elvis's catalog that, I could sort of do without at a certain point in time, but I never really get tired of Fever. The next song on side one is one of my favorite songs off this record, and that being The Girl of My Best Friend, which was written by Beverly Ross and Sam Bobrick. This song was originally recorded in 1959 by Charlie Blackwell. This song portrays the narrator as being, somewhat of a dirt merchant. Now, I'm here to tell you that I have done some pretty skeezy things in my life. I have been capable of behaving in an underhanded manner. But, one thing that I've never done, I guess I do have sort of my limits at the end of the day, is I've never pursued, nor have I tried to take away one of my friends' girls. Now, there was this incident back in my younger years where I worked with this girl, and I just happened to think that she was the bee's knees, and I sort of heard through the grapevine. Now, whether or not this was actually true or not, I don't know. Didn't really matter to me at the time. I was like 18 or 19 years old. I was just girl crazy. As you can probably imagine, it's probably not too difficult for you to visualize in your head. I was not at that point in time necessarily the most successful when it came to attracting members of the fair sex. In fact, most of my years in high school, anything that you could do to repel girls, I ruled at. But I heard through the grapevine that this girl that I worked with, that I thought was pretty snug, had a little bit of a crush on me. The problem being that she had a boyfriend, and normally this isn't something that I would do now. Now, this was a long time ago. I was like 18 years old, and for some reason, unbeknownst to me now, I sort of tried to, pursue this girl, even though I knew that she had a boyfriend. And actually, I sort of pursued her in a way that wasn't like aggressive, but I actively pursued her despite the fact that she had this dude. Looking back on it, it was probably one of the skeeziest things I've ever done. It's something that I actually feel a tremendous amount of guilt over, even all of these years later, probably almost 30 years later. Something I still feel guilt over, because I felt entitled to her. I felt like this guy that she was dating was a total idiot, which he was, which is fair. He was an idiot. But regardless of that, I had no right to do what I did. But it always makes me think of the song, because it wasn't one of my friends. In fact, this guy was somebody that I didn't really have a lot of use for. But looking back on it, it was something that I do feel guilty about. When I look back on some of the scuzzier things I've done in my life, you get the sense in this song that the narrator of this song is somewhat tortured by the fact that he is so drawn to his best friend's girl, but there's something about it, he can't help himself, which raises the question. I mean, come on, man! You're Elvis Presley. You can have any girl in the world that you want. Can't your friend just have this one? I mean, I guarantee you have a line of girls 3 miles long waiting just to sniff your socks. Let the poor sap have this one. Why don't you? Anyway, I love this song. This is one of the better songs on the entire record. Again, it sort of paints the narrator as being a little bit of a slime ball. It reminds me of one of the sleazier things that I've ever done. The next song after that is a song called I Will Be Home Again, written by Benny Benjamin and Louis Singer. This song was originally recorded by a vocal group called the Golden Gate Quartet in 1945. Now, the Golden Gate Quartet are a group that are, of course, from Norfolk, Virginia. This song features Charlie Hodge on backup vocals. Charlie Hodge is good for something besides just handing out scarves and glasses of water. This song was written in 1944, which makes me believe that this is a song written about a soldier who is getting ready to head off to World War II. It's very somber but hopeful. You get the sense that the narrator in this song is not only trying to convince his best gal that he will be home safe, but you get the sense he's also trying to convince himself of that. Now, 1944, being drafted into the military service, getting ready to head off to World War II must have been a very sobering experience as a Gen Xer. It's something that is totally foreign to me. I mean, my grandparents were the World War II/Korean War generation. My parents were sort of the Vietnam generation, and that must have been very scary. There must have been an element of fear, knowing that that is something that you may face at a certain age. It was a luxury that my generation had, that we never really had to worry so much about that. I also think that this song is sort of appropriate for this record because it is Elvis talking about, this is the first album that Elvis released following his own military service, and I think that this song sort of fits this album in that sense as well. This is a great song. I love World War II era songwriting. I am a big fan of World War II. Believe it or not, as inarticulate as I come across on this channel, I am a big reader. I love history. I love World War II. To me, this is actually one of the highlights on the album. It's sort of I don't know if this is like a deep track on the album, but it is a slightly deeper track on the album, but it's one of my favorites, I would argue. The next song after that is Dirty Dirty Feeling, which is the fifth song on side one, written by Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. And to me, this song sounds the most like where Elvis Presley is going to go instrumentally into the future once he starts sort of pumping out those soundtracks in the early and mid 1960s. It has a real Elvis Presley, soundtrack kind of sound to this song. It's short, it's concise, it's fine. To me, it's not really a standout song on the album. I mean, it's not the chunks. It's not a bad song. I don't really think that there's necessarily a bad song on this album, but if anything on this record sounds like soundtrack Elvis, to me it's the song Dirty Dirty Feeling. It's like 2 minutes long. It's fine. The next song after that is the sixth song on side one, which is Thrill of Your Love, which I absolutely love this song. This song was written by Stan Kessler. It was originally recorded in 1958 by Carl McAvoy, but his version of the song went unreleased until Elvis Presley's version was released. So this was probably the first version of the song that actually made it to record. I mean, this song is just snug. I mean, Elvis Presley's voice on this song is like silk sheets, man. You just slide in there, and it is just comforting immediately. This song sounds like, again, something from maybe the early RCA LP records. This is in very sort of 1957, 1958 sounding track. Rock and roll hasn't evolved a ton between Elvis's enlistment date and the date that he was discharged from the military, so you can still sort of get away with this sound now. A few years later, after the kind of British invasion thing sweeps in, this begins to sound a little bit archaic, but for 1960, for this record, this song fits perfectly. I love this song. This is actually one of my favorite songs on the record. That closes out side one. Side two starts off with a song called Soldier Boy, another sort of appropriately titled album, considering this is the return album from Elvis's Army Life. The song was written by David Jones. This is a song that is about a soldier who is pining for his girl while he's overseas. He's praying that no other young buck catches her eye while he is out serving the country. Again, I gotta say it, man, you're Elvis. This girl is not seeing anybody else while you were overseas. She is waiting very patiently for you to come home. Now, I'm willing to suspend disbelief and suggest that, yeah, Elvis, perhaps you were really worried about something like this while you're overseas. But, and obviously David Jones, when he wrote this song, wasn't necessarily writing it for Elvis Presley. But come on, man. Every girl in the world was lined up to get a piece of that. You don't have to worry. You were stealing other guys' girls. That's what was really going on, I'm sure of it. Anyway, track 2 on side 2 is probably, at least in my opinion, arguably the best song on this record, which is Such a Night. It was written by Lincoln Chase. This song was originally recorded in 1953 by the Drifters. And I'm sure you've probably heard the Drifters version of this song. It is the chugs. I mean, this is just a great song. I mean, I don't really know that you could necessarily make a bad version of this song. But to me, this is probably the high point of the album. Certainly one of the high points of the album. It's probably, like I said, it's probably the best known song on the album. This is a song I just never get tired of. Every single playlist I make for Elvis, whether it's on Spotify or whether it is for somebody else who is not as big a fan as I am, this is a song that I include every single time. I never get tired of it. My favorite use of this song is in the film 3,000 Miles to Graceland, which I'm sure you've seen it if you're an Elvis fan. I am a huge fan of that movie. But if you go back and you watch that movie, during the heist of the casino where Kevin Costner and his gang of casino robbing Elvises are pulling their heist, they actually play the song Such a Night throughout that scene, and it's just perfect. Actually, the Elvis impersonator that is sort of most featured in that scene, now that whole scene is full of people in Elvis regalia, but there's one Elvis impersonator in particular who is heavily sort of featured in that scene. He is somebody that I had an opportunity to meet very briefly a long time ago. Now, I don't remember his name, sadly, but back right around the time that this film was released, I went out to Las Vegas about 2 or 3 years in a row to go out to the Viva Las Vegas Rockabilly Festival. And the reason why I went out to the Viva Las Vegas Rockabilly Festival is because I am a huge fan of Elvis Presley. I'm a huge fan of first wave rock and roll. But that being said, I'm not, and really nor have I ever been, the hugest fan of contemporary rockabilly. And after a couple of years of going out to the Viva Las Vegas Rockabilly Festival, I just sort of lost interest in it because it was mostly contemporary rockabilly. I mean, even a band like the Stray Cats, who is a band that I want to like. I've always wanted to like the Stray Cats a lot more than I do. To me, they're just kind of boring, honestly. I mean, and if you go to the Viva Las Vegas Rockabilly Festival, I mean, not to say that those aren't good artists and good musicians if you're into that style of music, but I remember seeing artists like Big Sandy and Cave Cat Sammy and Kim Lenz and the Barn Shakers, Sonny Rogers, and all of these people. And I don't know, there's just something about contemporary rockabilly that doesn't really do it for me. I mean, like I said, I'm willing to suspend disbelief, but I mean, around this time, it's like 2002, 2003, 2004. And I mean, come on, man. I mean, there aren't any more soda fountains. Nobody believes that you're taking your best gal to the sock hop. So what are we even doing here? Not to mention the fact that most rockabilly people are kind of assholes, to be perfectly honest with you, at least in my experience. I mean, the car show was kind of a cool thing, but after a few years, I kind of lost interest in going to the Viva Las Vegas Rockabilly Festival. And I remember the last year I went to it, my ex-girlfriend and I cut out early because we were just seen enough. We just seen enough of people in 2005 singing about the sock hop. There hasn't been a sock hop since 1959, son. And so we ventured downtown and we checked out an Elvis show, which is something I always have to do when I go to Las Vegas. I always have to see an Elvis show, and I don't remember his name, but he was performing somewhere downtown, and he was the Elvis impersonator that was most featured in that scene of the casino heist. And I was with my ex-girlfriend, who was a big metalhead, and she was wearing a Judas Priest t-shirt. And at a certain point in the show, of course, they invite all the ladies to come up onto the stage and grab a scarf, which my ex-girlfriend didn't necessarily want to do. She wasn't really the biggest Elvis fan, but I asked her for me, because the guys weren't invited up on stage to grab scarves. I said, will you get an Elvis scarf for me at least? At which point she was a good sport and she agreed to do it. So she went up there and she's wearing a Judas Priest shirt, and whoever the Elvis, and again, I can't remember his name, but he was one of the best Elvis impersonators I've ever seen, but he sort of broke out of what he was singing, and as she approached the stage, he went into an Elvis rendition of Breaking the Law, which was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Seeing Elvis Presley sing Judas Priest was one of the coolest things I've ever seen. Certainly much cooler than anything you were going to be seeing sung at the Viva Las Vegas Rockabilly Festival, if you want my honest opinion. I think that was the last year we did the Viva Las Vegas Rockabilly Festival. I mean, I'm a huge fan of punk rock bowling. If you need to go to Vegas for a music festival, check out punk rock bowling. It is the jugs. But for me, Viva Las Vegas, you can have it. Not the film. I love the film. I'm talking about the music festival side. Anyway, the next song after that is the third song on side 2, which is It Feels So Right, written by Fred Wise and Ben Weissman. Instrumentally, this is one of the most unique songs on the record. It has a great vocal performance by Elvis. I mean, how can it go wrong for that? This song is basically like a sales pitch for just a shack. Like, come on, you know you want to. We're both here. We got nothing else going on. And again, you're dealing with Elvis. How could it possibly go wrong for Elvis when he's trying to convince a young lady to take a roll in the hay? And if Elvis really wasn't getting any overseas, I mean, if Priscilla really wasn't giving it up overseas, when he got home, man, he must have been pent up. He must have been just ready to tear him off repeatedly after getting home. The next song after that is a song called The Girl Went A-Walkin', written by Bill Rice and Tom Wayne. This song is okay. This is probably actually my least favorite song on the record. You know, there's a few songs on this record that have, you know, the same sort of sound as this one, except this one is a little bit more pedestrian sounding. So, The Girl Went Walkin' is probably my least favorite song on this record. I don't know. For me, it's kind of a skipper sometimes. The next song after that is Like a Baby. This song was written by Jesse Stone, originally recorded by Vicki Nelson in 1957. Again, I would say that this song is okay, much like The Girl Went Walkin'. This song isn't necessarily a high point on the record for me. It has a great vocal performance for Elvis, and I love the backing track by the Jordanaires. I think that their combination on that song is really awesome. I love the way that those voices complement each other. It has a real sort of succulent saxophone. Now, normally, I'm somebody that is not huge into saxophone. It's something that I have to take in very small doses, but when I like it, when it's done well, it's something that I do like it. The lyrics to the song are kind of annoying. It has sort of an unintentional sort of pedophile vibe that leave you covered in a, you know, very fine layer of filth that kind of makes you want to take a shower a little bit, you know, lyrically. To me, my least favorite song on the record is probably between this one and the song before it, Girl Went Walkin'. After that is a song called Reconsider Baby, written by Lowell Fulson. This song has a real sort of West Coast blues, early rock and roll kind of vibe. This is one of those songs that when I first started listening to this record many, many years ago, this was a song also that I kind of didn't like, but over the years, this is a song that's sort of like really grown on me. It's actually become one of my favorite songs on this record. Now, I'm not typically somebody that is the hugest fan of blues, vanilla blues, blues-based rock. I know you could say that all rock is blues based. I get it. I understand what you're saying, but I don't necessarily go for things that have that overt blues sound. And now I think that's one reason why this was a song that for many years didn't do it for me. But actually, it's grown over the years to be probably the song on this record that I've changed my opinion about the most, because now I'd say it's sort of one of my favorite songs on this record, despite the fact that it has a sound that I don't necessarily like. I like the song. It's sleazy. It's sweaty. It kind of reminds you of like a hot Memphis night. I don't know if you've ever had those nights out in Memphis, here in Nashville for that matter too, but Memphis is just a little bit more sexy and sweaty and swampy in the summer, and it's got the Mississippi River. You walk down Beale Street in August and you just drip, and that's kind of like what this song sounds like to me. It sounds like walking down Beale Street on just like a hot August night. Anyway, that song closes out the album. This is an album, like I said, I go back and listen to a fair amount. I've been listening to it a lot over the past week, trying to sit down and write some notes about it. It is not necessarily my favorite album in Elvis's catalog, but I do think it is a damn fine effort, considering he had just basically spent the last 2 years in forced hiatus, and a very important album because not only does it mark his return to the music field after said hiatus, but it's also the last classic album before June of 1969. Now, some of the soundtrack stuff, like I said before, some of the soundtrack stuff in terms of records are quite good. In fact, I celebrate the guy's entire catalog. I own every single one of those soundtracks, but the question is, are any of his soundtracks as good as this record? Any of the soundtracks that came after this record, are any of them as good as this record? I would say no. To me, the two bookend albums of the 1960s, this one and From Elvis in Memphis, are the two best. From Elvis in Memphis is, in my opinion, the greatest record that he ever made. So if you haven't gone back and checked out this record in a while, I would highly recommend it. It is good. I think it still stands up to the test of time. Everything that Elvis ever did still stands up to the test of time. That's why we are all so many fans, still so fans, after almost 50 years since this guy passed away. Anyway, man, thank you so much for checking out this video. This is Archaic Records. My name is Jamie, coming at you from Nashville, Tennessee. Be sure to go out and support your local record store. Check back most weeks for Morrissey Monday, a celebration of all things Morrissey and the Smiths, as well as other record content and album reviews throughout the week. And I guess that's just gonna about do her. So until next time, my friends, talk to you then.